Good afternoon / morning, everybody, whatever time zone you're in. Really nice to have you here, and thanks for joining us. I was saying to Nathan before when we kind of logged on, I'm conscious that this webinar today is probably a little bit different to a lot of the content on your platform and what you might used to be seeing from Data Science Dojo, because I'm not a data scientist, and I think I need to lead with that because there's plenty of you on the call today that are far more skilled in the technical aspects of analysis and business intelligence and AI than I am. At the same time, I guess the space that I work in is I often either work with technicians around how to communicate, how to actually get some of those insights in the work that you're doing into the rest of the organization. Or I work with other people in the organization to help them build capacity and skill to use the information that they're being given. So I kind of feel like I sit in this little wedge between the technicians and everybody else. And the reality that I guess we are now in is that data is no longer just the role of the analysts in our organizations. Everybody needs to be able to speak data, if you like. And I apologize for saying data, not data. I'm Australian, obviously. But everybody needs to be at least at a level where they're fluent in the information they're being given, or they need to be able to ask good questions. They need to know what they need. And, if there's a particular report or visualization that would make their life a little bit easier, we'd like to think that people actually know how to identify those or ask good questions to get that help. So what we're going to be talking about today is that challenge of data storytelling, what I kind of see and some of the themes I see in the different organizations across fields that I work with, and talk through, I guess, some of the ways that we can hopefully build people's capacity in data storytelling. So as Nathan said, I identify as a data storyteller and I'm an author. I've written 3 books now. My last one, it was called I'm Not a Numbers Person, and that came out earlier this year. And the reason I wrote it and the reason I named it that is because people say that to me all the time. They say, yeah, Selena, I get it, but I'm not a numbers person. I had somebody I had a friend a couple of years ago say to me, he said, Selena, I get it. I get that you love data. He said, but I like people. And I was like, those two things are not mutually exclusive. Actually, we need to think about how we merge those two together. And the challenge we've got is that there are plenty of people that we work with and that we're trying to communicate with that don't identify as numbers people. And there's a number of reasons for that. It could be that they grew up in a household where mum and dad didn't identify as numbers people, so they weren't really proactive in building their numeracy and talking to them about numbers and building their capacity in maths. We know that when we go to school, we have a maths subject and we have an English subject, and we follow those pathways through university or through high school and university. And often in Australia, anyway, people identify as being either a words person or as a numbers person. People are either good at English and humanities or they're good at math science. And what data storytelling requires is actually a merger of those two skills. So it's no longer okay or enough to say, well, I'm in one camp and not the other. And that's, I guess, the challenge that we've all got. And what I see, and when I talk about this with organizations and with technicians, this is actually not about just something that we pick up and do every now and then. Using data is not just an event. It's not something, that we need to spend time. We might say we've got a data meeting, which I've heard teams have, and then they don't think about using any data or evidence at all until the next meeting. That's kind of not the ideal scenario. The ideal scenario is where using data and evidence and relying on it is part and parcel of what we do. It's embedded in the organizational decisions we make. It's embedded in the conversations we have. We're not driven by it, but where it kind of permeates all of our work. So for me, you're probably already getting a few of the vibes about what I kind of come to this or how I come to this conversation and the views that I bring to this. But I just wanted to start with this, and I always lead these conversations with what my perceptions of data are, because I think it's really important not only for you to know where I'm coming from into this conversation, but also to get you to reflect maybe on what are some of your views. What do you bring to this conversation? So for me, there's a really clear distinction between being informed by the data and driven by it. And I fiercely advocate for being data informed at all times. 2 days ago in Australia, we just had the Melbourne Cup, which is it's a horse race in Australia, and horses come to Australia for this race from all over the world. And I always use a horse racing analogy to describe the difference between these two things. And it's just ironic that we're doing this in the week of the Melbourne Cup. But for me, being data driven is almost like a horse having blinkers on. So trainers will put blinkers on horses to try and distract them from the things that are happening around them. So horses come around the bend and they're racing towards the finish line. And the idea is that the blinkers shield the horse from being able to see what's happening around them. I reckon that that's a really good analogy for when we're data driven, because when we're data driven, we're looking at the end goal and we're just working as hard as we can towards that. And we're not necessarily paying attention to what's happening around the outside. But just like in a horse race, that horse, you might be able to switch off that context for that horse. But at the end of the day, the position that the horse finishes is completely dependent on the context. So when we're informed by the data, not driven by it, we're taking the blinkers off and we're aware of both the quantitative data, the qualitative data, but also our understanding of the teams we're working with, the people we're working with, the economy, like geographical differences and distances, any of those other contextual factors that impact your work, your team, or your organization. I also know that the language that we use with people, if we say to them, we want to make data-driven decisions, that can honestly, it can freak people out. People who are not numbers people can be made to feel really uncomfortable if they're told that something is data-driven or they're working in a data-driven team. When they're told on the flip side that they're going to be data informed and using evidence to inform their decisions, that can be not as confronting as being driven by it. So that's one of those kind of distinctions that I make. And as I said, I always like to start these presentations with some of my perspectives on this. The second one is around using multiple sources of data. So many of you would be aware of the notion of triangulation, which is where we use 3 or more sources of information to inform decisions. And we look for an on-balance trend and we make judgments across 3 data sets. So for example, if somebody wanted to know about the financial position of their organization, we wouldn't just use revenue to ascertain what our next steps would be or to get a picture of how the organization was going. Our financial position is so much more than revenue. And so wherever you sit in this technicians versus not being a technician and being somewhere else in the organization, I'd encourage you to think about how do you combine multiple sets of information and communicate those so that we're making on-balance judgments across different sets, not just using one. And the challenge with just using one set of information, we know, is that every data set has got noise and bias in it. Daniel Kahneman's book, recent book on noise, is a really great discussion of the variation that we get in human decision-making and in any data set. And and it's a really good reason and a reason why we would triangulate, because it allows us to see what's happening across, not just relying on one. One of the other things that I see a lot is that there's an assumption that when we use data in our organizations, that it's always negative, that data is used to identify the gaps, the things we need to do better, what our next steps might be. The flip side of that is there's actually a whole lot of information that we can use that is an opportunity for us to celebrate, to recognize great things that have happened, to show off some of the progress that we've made. So again, regardless of your role, I'd love you to be thinking about how are you looking for opportunities to celebrate and recognize those growth opportunities, or, the highest turnover, your best quarter, for example, for your organization. There's both things here. And when we're trying to bring other people along on the journey of using data, that's a really good way in. I really like the idea of thinking like a scientist, and Adam Grant talks about it in his book, Think Again. He says that oftentimes people think like politicians, prosecutors, or preachers. And in all 3 of those kind of thinking frames, we're not open to taking on new information, new evidence, and new data. he says, actually, what we need to be doing is trying to think like a scientist. And a scientist has a hypothesis. They test the hypothesis. They look for evidence to prove the hypothesis, and they kind of come up with results and discussion. He says what a scientist also does is they look for data and evidence that disproves the hypothesis. And so by doing that, they strengthen the findings because they're looking at the other angle as well. And this kind of feeds into that confirmation bias, which I'm sure you've heard a lot about and you talk a lot about regularly with data. When we're able to think like scientists, we acknowledge to the people that we work with that there's never just a one-size-fits-all approach. And we're also acknowledging that intelligence and our understanding is not fixed. We know the changes in evolution and understanding, say, in the field of science, and our understanding, say, even of the universe over the last 2 decades. And we know that our understanding is only going to continue moving forward. So being able to look at data and data sets through the lens of, let's think about this objectively, let's investigate and do the work and work out what's kind of happening. But at the same time, we're holding that view and that understanding with conviction, but we're also really open to new evidence and data as things evolve and things change. So when we work with people, everybody individually fits somewhere on this quadrant model. And the challenge, regardless of your role, is to think about how do we get people into the impact quadrant? Because when we're using data and we're using it well, that's where we're operating. We're having an impact. So everybody sits somewhere on this continuum of using no evidence at the very bottom, all the way through to using evidence and data at the top. As I said, so you fit somewhere on that continuum, on the vertical continuum, and so does everybody else that you work with. You could think even more broadly, make an on-balance judgment about the team that you're in. Where do you sit? And how do we kind of get people moving up this continuum as well? So when we talk about evidence, we're talking about kind of inter-organizational data. So what evidence do you have that's being generated by the organization? What are you kind of working with? We also might have evidence that comes from other organizations. We might have some that comes from research, totally dependent on what your field is. But we need to be using the internal evidence that we're generating and the external evidence. So how are you tapping into both of those sources and how much are you using that? In terms of the no evidence down the bottom, there's not many people that sit in this space because, well, sorry, I'm going to rephrase that. The challenge with the no evidence part is there actually is tons of evidence. Anybody who exists in the bottom half of this is choosing not to use the evidence that's available to them, or they're not kind of tapping into that resource. Let's think horizontally now. Everybody then fits somewhere across the page from left to right. And that's around, well, what are we actually doing? How much action are we taking? Are we reflective practitioners? Are we modifying what we're doing? Are we thinking about what's ahead? Are we being innovative? So people over on the right are doing that. They're being really innovative, really responsive. They're trying out new things. All the way over to the people on the left who are pretty happy doing the same thing over and over again. I've worked with people. I worked with somebody who literally said to me, Selena, I've done this for 20 years. Why would I change it? It's worked up until this point. I'm like, well, because humans have changed, organizations changed, everything has changed in 20 years. So everybody fits somewhere in one of these 4 quadrants, and you might feel like you just fall into one, or you're a long way across one, but not very high up, or vice versa. But to be honest, I don't work with many people in the stasis quadrant. They exist. They absolutely exist. To be honest, those people don't tend to turn up to webinars like this. They don't tend to call me and get me to come into their organization. But people who are there are not tapping into the evidence, and they're not taking any action. So that they are very much in that pattern and habit of doing the same thing over and over again. I occasionally work with people in guesswork. And they're people who are trying new things, and they're introducing new initiatives in the organization. They're trying out new things, but it's not necessarily grounded in what the data is telling them about what their customers, their clients, what their organization needs, or what's happening kind of elsewhere. So the problem with that, it's great and it can be really good, and we don't want to discourage those people from trying new things, but we certainly need to be thinking about how do we bring that evidence into their work, and how do we start having conversations with them about the data so they kind of know the baseline or where they're coming from and how they're matching the action with what people need. Most often, I work with people in the top left quadrant in lost opportunity. And that's because they've got access to so much evidence. They've got heaps of information. They've got heaps of data available to them, but they're not acting on it. And that's where many of you will come in, because you will be generating and providing a lot of this evidence and dashboards and information and business intelligence for people. And you might get frustrated because you think, well, they've got all the information and they're not doing anything about it. Oftentimes, the reason why I see people in this top left quadrant is because they actually don't necessarily know how to act on the information or what to do with it. Sometimes it's actually a fear. Sometimes they look at all the information and they identify an action that they could take, but they're scared to. They're worried that if they try something out or they try something new, what if it fails? Sometimes they feel like they're not given permission to. So I've worked with team leaders before who could see some really clear trends in the data, but didn't want to take action because they didn't feel they were allowed to. And they felt that they had to seek permission to go and try some new things. And obviously, those cultural challenges are a significant part of our organizations, and they're a key barrier to getting people into the impact quadrant. So the goal is to get people into impact, which is where they're using the evidence that's available and the data that's available to them, and they're trying new things and taking action. What we've got to recognize and normalize is that when whatever role we're playing in getting people to this point, it's never a perfect cause and effect relationship. It's not as simple as saying, this was the data for Q1. I'm going to put this intervention in place, and therefore this is going to be the data in Q2. We're dealing with complex systems, complex humans. We need to normalize people getting into the impact quadrant, but being able to try things out. It's that thinking like a scientist. What's your hypothesis? What are some things you're going to do? What are you going to test out? And kind of being okay with things not working out and being perfect every time they give something a go. So the challenge is, if you've got people in stasis and guesswork, we've got to move them. And if they're in stasis, it's not possible to get them to go diagonally across the page and go to impact. We can't do that. We've got to go one step at a time. So with people in stasis, we don't want them jumping into guesswork. We don't want them trying something out, not using the evidence, but changing things up and engaging in action, because inevitably it's probably going to fail, and then they're going to jump straight back into the stasis quadrant. So for both the stasis and the guesswork, what we need to do with them is we need to build their understanding of the evidence. So we're trying to move both of them up. So we're trying to move the people in guesswork into impact, and we're trying to move stasis into lost opportunity. And we do that by building capacity and their understanding of the data and the evidence that they've got available. For people then that are in lost opportunity, we want to move them into impact. So that's around, how do we engage them in data storytelling? How do we talk to them about, well, if this is the data, what are some actions that can occur as a result, and what might work? And it's about giving people the time, the space, the resources, and the capacity and permission to do that and to shift into the impact quadrant. So when I kind of first showed you this quadrant model, I got you thinking about, where would you put yourself? But I'd also like you to be thinking about, and hopefully you have been, where would you position people in the team, that you work with? Who are some of those people that are really frustrating for you? And where do they sit? And how do we actually kind of start to move them around this quadrant model to get them moving towards impact? So for me, the goal is data storytelling. And when we engage in data storytelling, we can get people from the lost opportunity into the impact. And when they're in the impact, we want them engaging in data storytelling. I'm really cognizant of the fact, though, that data storytelling doesn't come easily to everybody. And we can't just assume that people can get there without doing some groundwork first. And for me, these are kind of three big pieces of the puzzle. And I get to work with organizations across a range of sectors. So I've done work in like records and information management, and in healthcare, and in banking, and in real estate. And I use this, and in education, and I use this model for everybody. The first part is that we need people in our organizations actually having a decent data literacy. They need to understand what the numbers mean, what they are, what the metrics are, because we can't expect them to engage in the data storytelling piece unless they actually get the numbers to begin with. So the challenge with that is that every metric we're asking somebody to use, to understand, every metric we're communicating to other people, every single one has got a different context that sits around it. So revenue, for example, percentage profit, loss, for example, percentage loss, all of those things mean something different. And I could go on. I worked with a team of middle managers the other day, and I said, how many different data sets do you have that you could use to inform your work? And they came up with 46 different types of data. Now, it's not possible for people to be using and acting on 46 types of information, but in terms of data literacy, that's 46 different types of literacy that sits around each of those sets. Charles Seif wrote a book called Proofiness, You're Being Fooled by the Numbers. I really like it. It's definitely worth a read if you haven't checked it out. But there's one thing he says in there. He says, nobody cares about the number 5. He said, it's not until we put a context around the numbers that it actually means something to people. So for example, if it's 5 degrees, if I win $5 million, if I own 5 dogs, if I eat 5 tacos, all of those things mean something completely different. And every data set that we're trying to communicate and work with has that context that sits around it. And sometimes there's a lot of assumptions that people actually know what they mean. And all of my work would indicate that some of those assumptions are probably unfounded. There's a lot of work to be done in people's data literacy. The second part of that is then visualizations. So for the analysts and the data scientists in this call today, this is probably your jam. You know this stuff back to front, you know the benefits of different visualizations, you know which visualizations suit different purpose, and what might be the best way to represent different sets of data. The users and consumers of that information don't have the same understanding as you. And again, there's often a lot of assumptions around people's ability to read and understand the visualizations, pardon me, that they've been given. So for example, we see line graphs and bar charts all the time. We see them in the media, we see them regularly, we see them in socials. But things like a scatter plot or a quadrant scatter with 2 different factors, or a box and whisker plot, they can be really powerful and useful visualizations, but people often don't actually understand how to read and interpret that information. So I was presenting at an organization yesterday. They have national reports that come from a governing body, and the key visualization that is used is a box and whisker plot to represent the spread of results across 5 different domains. Not one person in the room, from employee to exec, could tell me or could talk about how to read and interpret a box and whisker plot. And that's not uncommon. That's what I see and experience every time I go into an organization that has visualizations in that way. So we know the power of visualizations. We know that, a picture's worth 1,000 words. We know that, for example, if we were to graph crypto, which changes every second, we could very easily see a 6-month trend for Bitcoin, for example, and there are millions of data points in that visualization. We know the power of it, but it's about how do we create visualizations that people understand, and if they don't understand them, how do we build their capacity? How are we supporting them to get into that impact quadrant? Because they need the visualizations to help them do that. The challenge, though, is data storytelling and getting to the point of data storytelling, because you can, and your organization can have a brilliant team of analysts who have exceptional data literacy and exceptional visualization capacity. But unless we get to the point of data storytelling, that information is not influencing or shifting or changing the organization. The goal is, when we're talking about the storytelling itself. For me, and there's a lot around how we communicate data and how we talk about data in terms of the storytelling. For me, I want to focus on what we actually do in that, how we get people on board and how we kind of encourage them to do the storytelling. So we want to build their capacity in the data literacy. We want to build their understanding of the visualizations, but then we need to drag them into the space where we're talking about these two things. The first one for me is around what are the insights? And again, if you're a technician and you're working with people who aren't, like, don't assume that people know how to identify insights, because often they don't. So one of the things that I really like that Gary Klein says in his book about insights is this idea that an insight is a discovery of new patterns. So being able to have that conversation with the people that you work with about what shifts your perspective. Because what we do is we have tons of information in a report that, say, we're generating and providing to staff. We've really kind of condensed in the funnel. We've really condensed that information down into a report, into an executive summary, but not all of that is insightful. The insight is the stuff that shifts our perspective. And Gary Klein talks about the difference between it being like oh yeah, that's interesting, to an, oh, okay, like an aha moment. So the challenge with insights is that people don't know how to find them or see them. They don't understand that language around the shifting perspective. And the additional complication is that different people will identify different insights, and that's okay. So I watched the news the other night, and house prices in Australia have gone crazy through the pandemic. So they've just skyrocketed. And in the 30-minute news section that I was watching, the one insight that stood out to me was a reporter that was saying there's an estimate in Australia that some house prices are going to drop by 43%. So as a homeowner, that was an insight for me. And in that 30-minute program, that's the only, honestly, right now, that's the only thing I can remember from that 30 minutes of the news that I watched. But for people who lived in an area where there was a crime report, or for people who, are really concerned about the cost of living and the increase in prices in groceries and that sort of thing, that there would have been information in that would have been an insight for them. So even when we are provided with the same information, what we choose as insights aren't necessarily the same. So there's some work to be done with people in our organizations to help them identify those things. And as the technicians, we need to think about, well, how are we providing the information that they need in a way that is easy to digest for starters, in visualizations that they understand, providing understanding of the metrics that matter to them. But then how are we funneling that so that they can look at and identify insights themselves? The second part then is, what do I do about them? So again, at this point, up until this point of identifying insights, so we've got the data literacy, we've got the visualizations, we've got our report, we've got people reading it, they've identified insights. Nothing has changed in the organization at this point. So when we have the insights, that's when we can start talking about, well, what do we actually do about them? What's the work that can happen? What are some possible options? And again, the way the actions and the things that we do are going to be influenced by our own experiences, our own understanding, our biases, all of those experiences and things, and us as a human that we bring to the conversation. So when we work with people to think about, well, what do we do about the insights? The benefit actually in both of these is really about getting multiple people together. It should never just be about a leader, one single person saying to a team, these are the insights I see in the data, and this is what we're going to do about it. Because if you go back to what we were talking about kind of a couple of minutes ago, the insights that you see are the insights that you see. And if you show me your data set, I might see something slightly different. And then your understanding of actions and what you might do about it adjust your perspectives. And there might be a lot of similarities if we were to sit down and have a conversation about it. But it's really important that we get heads together and we get people talking about how they can actually use the information that they're being given and what that might look like for them. The challenge with data storytelling, as I kind of spoke about at the beginning, is that some people don't identify as numbers people, and there's a real, maths anxiety is a thing. Dyscalculia absolutely influences about 2% of the population. So we know that there is genuinely a real fear out there. For me, there's a couple of principles. So if you're leading conversations like this, if you're trying to support conversations like this, there's a couple of principles that I wanted to just go through that I reckon they really help a team when they're having a conversation about data, particularly when people are apprehensive and they're not sure how it's going to go, what it's going to look like. The challenge is, until people start having these conversations and sitting in meetings where they're talking about numbers, they're not going to get better at it themselves. So a lot of the learning and talking about data actually comes from seeing and experiencing other people engaging in this process as well. So what I recommend often to organizations is, if you're going to have a meeting about data and if people are a little bit apprehensive, these are some good principles to almost kind of prime the environment, to set the conversation up, hopefully for success, and to normalize some of the things that are happening in the conversation. So being able to say that we recognize that each data set is only a tiny piece. No data set is the absolute point of truth, and it's never going to tell us absolutely everything that we need to know. Just acknowledging that with people can be really powerful. I work a lot with schools as well. And so talking about literacy data with teachers, initially teachers are like, well, we don't want kids doing standardized assessment because it doesn't assess everything and it doesn't actually show the type of little person that they are, or how friendly they are, or how collaborative they are. And all of that is true. But as a team, if we can kind of acknowledge the limitations of any single data set like that, I reckon it's a really good way to start the conversation and to move it forward. We recognize that every data set's got noise and bias. So that kind of comes back to that part around no data set is perfect. They're all going to have issues. So what we want to do is to triangulate, to use those multiple sources, and we trust the majority of what's happening. So if we see a trend happening in 2 out of 3 sources, then that's what we're going to follow. That's kind of the lead we're going to follow. We're not just going to have one set of information that drives all our decisions. No single human has all the answers, and we value dialogue rather than that one-way transmission of information. So we don't want the sage on the stage saying, this is the data, these are the insights, this is what you're doing about it. It's better if we have conversations and meetings where we send people the data beforehand, they've got time to read over it, to look at it, and even prep them by saying the 2 things we're going to talk about are what are the insights that you're seeing and what are some possible things we can do in response. We really want to be facilitating a conversation about that rather than just transmitting information. So the next one, and again, I think for people that are a bit freaked out by data, this is a good way of normalizing this conversation a little bit and hopefully making them feel a little bit better about it, because no single set can ever be attributed to one person. I worked with an exec a few years ago who his performance was completely dependent on one metric at the end of the year. So it was a 12-month, like it was a once every 12-month metric. And basically his success, he was almost held personally responsible for that single data point at the end of a 12-month period. He had worked in the organization for decades, was loved by everybody, had been on the exec for 20 years, like really well liked, really like salt of the earth, great guy. One year that I was working with him, he didn't hit the target that had been set for him in that metric at the end of the year. And as a result, he was performance managed for the next 12 months. And I fiercely advocate against this kind of use of data now, because he and you, no single person or single team is ever truly and solely responsible for a set of information that comes out or a data point. There are so many different factors that contribute, and we can't do things like that where we're penalizing teams, holding them accountable because of the results of a single metric. It's really, really problematic. Curiosity is a really important one. So sometimes people come in and assume that they know all the answers straight away. And Daniel Kahneman's work on system 1 and 2 thinking, so thinking slow and thinking fast, is a really kind of good thing for you to be talking to your team about. The first things that come to mind are not necessarily the best or not always the best, and that's okay. But being able to allow people or giving people the time and space to think slowly, and being curious about the numbers, to really think about all of the possibilities, all of the insights, and coming in with a lens of curiosity and thinking like a scientist rather than thinking like a politician, prosecutor, or preacher, like Adam Grant talks about. To facilitate this kind of shared ownership and responsibility and conversation, we want to use language that's really collaborative. So us, we, our team, we don't want to be singling people out and saying you, they should, you need to, that kind of thing. The other part of that is using statements like, yes, that's true, and rather than yes, but, which can be a bit more confrontational for people that are struggling to kind of engage in the conversation to begin with. So I often work with people who will try in a conversation with me, they'll justify a result. And obviously COVID has had a significant impact on turnover for some companies. And I have people say to me, yes, Selena, the reasons why this is still low is because the pandemic hasn't, we haven't kind of jumped back up from pre-pandemic. We're not there yet. So we can't really do anything about it. And I always reframe that to yes, that's all of that is true. And what is in your sphere of influence? What is possible in your work that you could do, or what are the next steps that might be possible for you, rather than a yes, but, which can be a little bit more confrontational. And the very last one there is around acknowledging and saying that we value everybody's perspectives. And given that we know insights and ideas around action are going to be unique to us, they're going to be influenced by our experiences, our own biases, what we know about the situation. We actually want to be tapping into multiple brains and multiple people in this conversation. So saying from the get-go that we value everybody's perspective and a contribution to the conversation is a really good way to get people on board. So that almost brings me to the end of my presentation, and we will be going to a Q&A in a sec. But I'd like to think, when we first started, one of the first things I talked about was this is about people. It's about being informed by the data, not being driven by it. And ultimately, our goal, whatever your role and your background is, it's how do we get people into that impact quadrant? And the way we do that is through supporting them and helping build their capacity in those areas of data literacy, data visualization, and then ultimately data storytelling. So I might pause there and hand back over to you, Nathan, and we'll go to some questions.
We live in this, I don't know if it's a post-COVID world or still COVID world, but I cannot remember to unmute myself every single time. Ask my whole marketing team, every single meeting we have, I'm always muted and I always start talking and I always forget. Anyways, thank you so much. That was great. Before we start doing questions, and to also give people a chance to type them out, I am actually going to talk about next week's webinars first. So I'm just going to share my screen here really quick. And hopefully this does it every time. All right, so next week, September 8th at 12 p.m. Pacific, and I'm showing you today's webinar, but let's talk about next week's webinar. November 8th at 12 p.m. Pacific, we have storytelling data with Camilla Manera, and Camilla, hopefully I'm saying your name correctly, but it's going to be kind of an extension of the talk that Selena just gave us today, but we're going to dive deeper into, how do you build that narrative with your data. You can RSVP on our website, or also just join the live stream for those of you that are on LinkedIn or YouTube or any of those other ones. And then the following day, November 9th, we're going to be doing a topology for time series with Colleen Fairley. She's a lead machine learning scientist. And we'll be doing an overview of time series data, examining South African and Egyptian stock markets, and talking about different topological algorithms for time series. And again, you can RSVP on our website or just join us on one of our live streams. All right, that's enough of that. And now we can go to questions. So the first question is from Juan. Juan was on one of our live streams. And I think you kind of talked about this a little bit when you were going through the principles. But how do we make people trust in the data we have obtained, especially when we talk to non-technical people in the organization?
Yeah, it's a good question, because the validity and reliability of data is a key factor, right? And for often what I find is that people who are fearful of it, they often question the source. I think part of that is normalizing the noise and bias part, but also hearing their concerns. There's noise and bias in everything. And we also know that every data set only ever measures one little tiny thing. So to be honest, if there were then concerns about actual collection, that would be a conversation that I would want to have. So if there's inconsistency around the collection, and that's something that they actually know about and can talk about, then I'd absolutely bring them into the conversation and try and reduce any kind of challenges with that.
Okay, sorry, and I'm laughing here because Tom says thanks, and he has to run because he's taking his son to Cub Scouts. So thanks for being here, Tom. Have a good one.
Thanks, Tom.
Okay, so thank you. And this is next question is from Terry. What was that book that you mentioned? It contained the Fooled by Numbers in the title.
Proofiness, How You're Being Fooled by the Numbers, and it's Charles Seife. I think it's Seife is his surname.
Okay, Fatima, maybe you can find it and post a link for us. Anita, I guess this isn't really a comment, more of a Fatima, maybe take note. I just want to say that I like this time of day. It makes it easier to attend live. If anybody else feels the same way, why don't you leave us a comment in the chat so that we can find the best time to host these. Maybe 7 a.m. in Australia is the best time for us. And then this is from Leo. Can you please tell me about the best structure for data storytelling, insights to findings, etc.? Is there like a sort of template that you find works best?
For the insights, I talk through it. So I kind of talk through the way that I've spoken with you about it today, identifying, even talking about anomalies. What are the things that jump out at you, things that are really high, like using some of that, I guess, everyday language is a key part. For me, I get people to write a list of insights. So the organization I was working with yesterday, we were looking at their dashboard and I was directing them to different parts of their dashboard. And this was kind of all employees. Company had about 40 employees altogether, from kind of up to exec. And I got them to list all of their insights. And so I talked through what that looked like. It's the stuff that's surprising. It's the things that shift your perspective. They literally just listed on a piece of paper or on their computers. I then got them to think about, because we can't action every insight. So how do you then prioritize those insights? And I asked them to look for then the most important, like almost the 3 most important insights that they've seen. So we kind of did all the exploration, really kind of targeted exploration in the pages that I directed them to, and then got them listing the insights, prioritizing the insights. And then one of the things that I often do when they've got the insights is to think about, I get them to do like a 3x3 grid. And I say, okay, well, if they're the insights that you want to action, what are some possible options for action? And I get them to fill in the 3x3 grid. And I make them think of 9 possible actions. And that goes back to that system 1, system 2 thinking. We want people thinking slowly about possibilities. So yeah, it's not necessarily a template or high tech, but that everyday language, normalizing what's jumping out at you, what are the anomalies, what are the things that surprise you, prioritizing, and then thinking about the actions. But the 3x3 grid's hard. People often find it really tough to think of 9 possible actions, but I make them do it. And I sit and wait until they fill all 9 boxes. And then I explain why around the system 2 thinking.
Okay, and I think a couple of people are getting confused about where to post questions. So you should have a little tab called Q&A. If you just put it in there, I know, Ted, you put your question in both, which is totally fine. And there's the other one, perfect. So where was I? That one. There we go. Okay. Actually, Ted, your question's up. So, how do you define a data story, and does it necessarily include data visualizations?
Yeah, look, I really like Brent Dyke's work on effective data storytelling, and he says that a data story has data, visuals, and the narrative. Does it have to include a visual? I would say no, not necessarily. I think a visual certainly helps because people often remember the things that they see. And as we said, a picture's worth 1,000 words. I don't know that it has to, but absolutely can include it. I was looking at, I was actually watching something this morning about the difference in retention and learning for people when there's everyday language is used as opposed to technical language. And there was like a 63% growth or in performance for people who were in the experience with the everyday language versus the technical. And, that was this morning, but there were no visuals in that. I was just listening to somebody talking about it and I remember it. So no, I don't think there absolutely has to be a visual, but I think it does absolutely help.
Okay. And what do you do when a company asks you to get insights from data, but the data isn't enough or appropriate and they're just not listening to you?
Well, that's a big question. So one of the things I often do with organizations first is a data plan. So there is so much information and a lot of organizations in Australia, at least, are heading to a data plan where they start to think about, well, what's the information that different teams require? And then what do we want them to actually, in the data plan, I actually put in insights and actions. So what are some possible things you're looking for and what are some possible actions that you might take as a result of it? Going through that process can often identify holes. So if there's data that's missing, they might kind of say, okay, well, our marketing team, for example, has access to this, this, and this, and this is what we want them to use. And going through that process sometimes brings to the surface some of those gaps. So that's a useful kind of conversation to have. In saying that, though, the data plan often helps people almost, again, funnel or filter the information down into more manageable chunks, where rather than just saying, we want you to use data as a big picture, kind of big generalization, it allows organizations to really narrow the focus of, if you're in this team, these are some of the expectations for you. There was a second part to that question, Nathan, and I've totally forgotten it. What are you about? What if they don't listen to you?
Yeah, what if they're just not listening? What do you do?
Yeah, isn't that a good question? I love Simon Sinek's work around the why. So in anything we do, if we're trying to persuade or to share with other people and we want them to change what they're doing, think about the why. So your why is often elevated above the how and the what. And you often, when you go to the why, and if you can get to the core purpose and either the calling or the service to your clients or whatever it might be, if you can tap into that in your communication with the people that you're trying to persuade, I think that can be more powerful. Because at the end of the day, if you think that there's something missing, I'd think about, well, why is that important to you? How is it going to benefit the organization, your people, your clients, and lead with that.
Okay. Jan's F heard it here first. So approaching data for insights versus approaching it for problem solving. What's your view on either approaches?
Yeah, so there's definitely ways, like you can look at data through, say, an exploratory or an explanatory lens. They're kind of the two main ways that I get organizations to look at that. And that kind of comes from research. You often research to explore something or to explain. I guess it very much depends on the process for the organization. So the explanatory is almost like a problem solving. So if you have a particular area of the company that you want to learn a bit more about, you would dig into and look at the metrics that are related to that specific avenue. And then you would still, with that kind of narrow focus, you would then still think about what are the insights, and then in terms of problem solving, what are we doing about it? if we were just doing a big exploratory analysis, that's not something that we would do with all employees. Like, where you wouldn't want to go into a meeting and say, this is everything we've got available, go for a dig and find something interesting. It is usually that very targeted and specific focus. And one of the big issues I see with people rolling out dashboards in organizations, so people, there's a lot of money being spent in the development of Power BI and Tableau dashboards to visualize all of their metrics. And then the biggest mistake I reckon people make when they roll it out is they give people access, they sit in a team meeting and they say, go and have a play and see what you find. And it's like, there are thousands of rabbit holes that any user could go down, and not all of it is useful or important. So the more targeted and specific we can be in that inquiry, I reckon the better, and we get better outcomes as a result.
Okay. And then this next question is kind of a two-parter. So how do you fit 3 insights / 9 actions models into your overall strategy? And then there's kind of a clarification. And I think it's the same person. So, and they mean, if you select insights, do you prioritize them against the quarterly or yearly goals? How do you include anomalies / insights that are unexpected into conversations?
Yeah, good question. With the prioritization, I always think about using Stephen Covey's Eisenhower matrix of what's urgent and important. And there might be things that are unexpected, as you say. And I believe that if you're identifying it as urgent and important, it needs to be added in. And if that means dropping off something or pushing something to the next quarter that isn't urgent and important, I think that needs to happen. So I would also want to be looking at, in terms of your quarterly and yearly goals, the whole lag and lead measures. So when you're looking at insights in a particular narrow focus, you would like to think that the data that you're doing that with is attached to your quarterly and yearly goals. You wouldn't like to think that it's completely separate, but completely valid. Sometimes other things come up that you hadn't anticipated. But yeah, I think urgent and important is a really good way of looking at it and helping prioritize.
Okay, well, that was our last question. I know there was a few people asking about if the slides will be available with the recording. We'll talk to Selena about that later.
I'm very happy to do that, and I can.
Okay, so we'll include them as a resource when we upload the recording. So just look for it. If it's on YouTube, there'll be a link in the description. If it's on our website, there'll be a little resources section that you can get the slides from. But Selena, thank you so much for being here with us today. It was a pleasure having you. And thank you to everyone who joined live or is now, I guess, watching the recording in the future, in the Australian future that we live in. I hope everyone has a good rest of their day. And Selena, I hope a full day for you, I guess.
Yep, absolutely. Thanks so much, everybody.